A millionaire hires a fake wife to trick his sick grandfather and secure his inheritance. But was he ready for what comes next? Before we start the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Dylan Langford wasn't the kind of man who made concessions. With a calculated gaze and a controlled smile, he ran his businesses with a firm hand, building a financial empire without ever needing anyone's advice or support. However, that morning, he found himself in an unexpected situation. Dylan was about to inherit his grandfather George's estate, who was gravely ill. But when talking to his grandfather's lawyer, Dylan discovered a crucial condition in the will to receive the inheritance. "Dylan," the lawyer began, "your grandfather wants you to inherit, but there's a condition." "Condition?" Dylan frowned, surprised. He expected his grandfather to simply leave him the fortune and properties without any hassle. After all, he was the only heir. "Yes, Mr. George wants you to get married. Only after a formal marriage can you receive the entire inheritance." The idea sounded absurd to Dylan. Him, married? It made no sense. He never cared for long-term relationships and never had time to dedicate to anyone. "Does the marriage need to be legally recognized?" Dylan asked, his tone clearly showing his displeasure. "Yes, it's a requirement of the will, and it needs to happen before your grandfather passes away, so he can bless it." "It's a matter of honor for him," said the lawyer. Dylan sighed, feeling cornered. George always valued true love and family unity, something Dylan considered an outdated ideal. To him, marriage was just an unnecessary formality, a distraction. The rest of the day, Dylan remained pensive. The idea of marriage was entirely foreign and contrary to his nature. However, he needed the inheritance to ensure the expansion of his business, and the image of his grandfather, on his deathbed, waiting for this last request, also weighed on him. The next day, after a restless night, Dylan decided he needed a practical solution, a way to fulfill the requirement without real involvement. While driving through the streets of Miami that morning, thinking about how to put this idea into practice, Dylan stopped at the cafe he always frequented to grab a coffee and reorganize his thoughts. He saw Grace, the cafe owner, putting up a closed sign with a sad expression. Dylan approached and asked, "Closing for good?" Grace turned to him, surprised. Her eyes showed a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "Yes, I have no choice. I can't keep up with the bills anymore. The cafe was my dream, but it seems like it's over." She looked down, visibly trying to control her emotions. Dylan was silent for a moment and started to think. Although he didn't know her well, he had exchanged a few words with her during his visits to the cafe. She might be the right person for his plan. "Grace, what if I told you there's a way to keep the cafe open?" He watched her closely, looking for any sign of interest. Grace raised her eyes, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I need something, and you need money. Maybe we can help each other." Grace's expression became even more intrigued, and Dylan just kept his steady gaze. He had a plan, and Grace might be exactly what he needed to execute it. Dylan knew the proposal he had in mind wasn't common, nor something someone would easily accept. However, he needed to act fast. The image of his grandfather, George, on his deathbed was still fresh in his mind. This deal could solve his problems, and at the same time, save Grace's dream. "Grace," he began, in a firm tone, "what I'm going to ask might seem strange, but before you answer, I want you to think about the possibilities." She raised her eyebrows, intrigued, but kept her eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for him to reveal some important secret. "I'm listening," she said, crossing her arms. "I need a wife," he blurted out, watching her reaction. Grace blinked, surprised. A slight laugh escaped before she composed herself, visibly confused. "Sorry, what? I must have misunderstood." "You heard right," he confirmed. "My grandfather demands that I get married to release the family inheritance. Without that, everything I've built and all the projects I've planned will fall apart. It's his requirement, and I need to fulfill it. But I'm not talking about a real marriage," he hurried to clarify, seeing her stunned expression. "It would be an agreement, something temporary." Grace shook her head, trying to absorb what she had just heard. "So, you want to marry me? To get an inheritance?" "Basically, yes. I know it sounds crazy, but it's a simple contract, a union that would solve both our problems at once. In return, I'd pay you enough to clear your debts and keep the cafe running." She crossed her arms, clearly weighing the idea. Dylan could see she was considering it, maybe even intrigued, but still hesitant. "What happens after this marriage ends?" Grace asked, her voice firmer than he expected. "Once my grandfather passes, we can annul the marriage. Everything would be done practically and discreetly. You wouldn't need to get involved beyond that. No feelings, just business," he assured her, trying to make the proposal as professional as possible. Grace looked at the cafe, her eyes reflecting all the struggle and sacrifice she had put into it. He knew the proposal tempted her, that the chance to save her dream was enticing. But Dylan also knew she was a person of strong principles and values. Accepting something so impersonal and calculated went against everything that seemed important to her. "This feels surreal," she said, looking at him thoughtfully. "But what you're proposing would solve my problems." Dylan nodded, seeing that she was at least open to the idea. "It's a trade, Grace. You help me, and I help you. Nothing more than that." For a moment, silence hung between them. Grace seemed lost in thought, probably imagining the implications of accepting a contract marriage. He hoped she would see it as he did, a mutually beneficial deal. Finally, she looked up and, with a slight sigh, asked, "If I say yes, how will this work?" Dylan felt a mix of relief and triumph. He was closer than he thought to solving the dilemma. "If you agree, I'll take care of all the details. It'll be discreet and no one needs to know. Just think about what this means. With the money, you can not only keep the cafe open, but also expand it." Grace considered his words, taking a deep breath. He knew she was about to make the hardest decision of her life. The weight of the dilemma was clear in her eyes, but hope also shone there. As if for the first time she saw a way out of her troubles. She looked at him, determined. "If this will save my dream, then yes, I agree." Dylan felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. He had found the solution. Now, the plan could begin to unfold. Dylan and Grace met the next afternoon in his office, a luxurious space with huge windows offering an impressive view of the city. Grace felt out of place there, and her slight discomfort was obvious. She looked around, absorbing the sophisticated environment she wasn't used to. Dylan, on the other hand, was in his element. He approached the desk, where a neatly arranged contract with several pages lay. Without hesitation, he pointed to the document. "This is the formal agreement," he explained, his voice calm, almost cold. "It covers all our needs: a temporary marriage, no emotional involvement, and significant financial compensation for you. Once the will's clause is fulfilled, you'll be free to go your own way." Grace looked at the contract, hesitant. "And what exactly do I need to do?" "We'll officially marry at the courthouse and attend some events as a couple. That's it. For all intents and purposes, we'll be husband and wife, but only in the eyes of others," he explained, trying to simplify as much as possible. "Let's play a game with those who only read the comments? Type pizza in the comments. Only those who get this far will understand. Now let's continue with the story." She nodded, still scrutinizing the contract with a worried expression. The situation was surreal, but she was determined to save the cafe. With a deep sigh, she picked up the pen and signed her name on the paper. Dylan smiled slightly, satisfied. "Great. With this, we've formalized our agreement." They prepared for the civil wedding, scheduled for the next day. Grace could hardly believe what she was about to do. It was hard to accept that she was marrying for a contract, something so far from the values she grew up with, but she needed to move forward. The cafe meant everything to her, and this was her chance to start over. On the day of the civil wedding, Grace wore a simple dress, while Dylan donned an impeccable suit. The contrast between them was striking, but to strangers, they made an interesting couple. During the ceremony, they maintained a professional demeanor, with no exchanged glances or romantic words. When the judge declared them officially married, they only shook hands in a quick, formal gesture. His grandfather, who was present at the ceremony, found his grandson's coldness a bit odd. After the ceremony, Dylan suggested they go to a restaurant to celebrate discreetly, just to keep up appearances. Grace agreed, still trying to get used to the idea of being the wife of someone she barely knew. During dinner, as they settled at the table, Grace finally broke the silence, trying to ease the tension. "So, now we're officially married." Dylan gave a brief smile. "Exactly, and because of that, we're one step closer to our goal." She nodded, forcing a smile. As much as she tried to view it practically, it was hard to ignore the strangeness of being married to a man she had known for such a short time. Dylan seemed to sense her discomfort and decided to change the subject. "Why did you decide to open a cafe?" he asked, curious. Grace relaxed a bit with the question and answered with a slight sparkle in her eyes. "It's always been a dream of mine. I wanted a place where people could come and feel welcome, something simple but special." Dylan noticed the enthusiasm in her voice. It was something he rarely saw, passion. Deep down, it intrigued him. He, who always focused on numbers and results, was facing someone who valued a small but significant dream. And, without knowing exactly why, it sparked a strange feeling in him. "It's good to have something to fight for," he commented almost thoughtfully. Grace smiled back, maybe for the first time without the formality imposed by the contract. "I guess now we both have something to fight for, don't we?" He nodded, still looking at her. For the first time, it felt like this wasn't just a cold, calculated deal. There was something more. Maybe, without realizing it, they were both involved in something that went beyond the simple contract. With dinner finished, they left the restaurant side by side. Dylan offered her a ride, and as he drove, he realized his life had just taken a turn he never anticipated. And looking at Grace, he knew this temporary union might have consequences neither of them could yet imagine. That week, Grace tried to adapt to the unusual routine of being married to Dylan Langford. The visits to events and meetings were intense, and to Dylan, they all seemed like strategic commitments, opportunities to ensure the world believed in their marriage. Grace, on the other hand, struggled to feel comfortable. At every dinner and cocktail party beside Dylan, she felt out of place in the world of luxury and appearances. The following days brought an increasingly intense and unexpected routine for Grace and Dylan. Meetings and events multiplied, and Grace's constant presence by his side became something familiar to him, even as he tried to keep his focus on the initial goal. But for Grace, the closeness with Dylan only heightened her internal dilemma. One morning, as they were preparing for an important meeting with investors at Dylan's company headquarters, Grace observed the environment with a mix of fascination and discomfort. She found herself thinking about how he had built that empire, driven by a determination and coldness she never possessed. "Have you always been this dedicated to work?" she asked casually as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. Dylan looked at her through the reflection, surprised by the question. "Always. For me, work is everything." He hesitated, choosing his words. "My grandfather always taught me to be independent, to rely on no one, and so far it's worked." Grace smiled slightly. "I think life should be more than that, right? More than contracts and business meetings." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He felt a certain pressure in his chest whenever Grace spoke of her values, and it made him reflect more than he liked. There was an internal conflict growing within him, a desire to understand her perspectives, but also a fear that it would distract him from the main plan. At the meeting, Grace once again surprised Dylan. Despite her little experience in the corporate world, her genuine presence and natural way of dealing with people captivated the investors, who didn't expect such authenticity in a formal environment. Without knowing it, Grace was showing Dylan that there were other ways to connect and lead, a more human way he had never considered. Later that same day, as they were heading back to the office, Dylan noticed that Grace seemed distant, lost in thought, as if something was weighing on her mind. "What's wrong?" he asked, curious. She sighed, looking out the car window. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, you know? This agreement between us. I mean, I needed the money, but I'm not sure I can see myself in this for the long haul, living something that's not completely real." Dylan frowned, uncomfortable with her honesty. On one hand, he knew Grace had reasons to feel this way. But on the other, he wasn't ready to deal with the feelings her words stirred in him. "You agreed to the contract knowing what it meant," he replied, trying to keep a practical tone. "It was a conscious choice." Grace nodded, but her expression remained somber. "Yes, I know. It's just that now, it doesn't seem so simple. It's strange to fake something that in part feels so real." Dylan didn't have an answer for that. He knew the contract was temporary, that Grace wouldn't be around forever. But hearing her words, something inside him wavered. For the first time, he considered the possibility that this fake marriage might have become more than just a temporary alliance for him too. That night, after dropping her off at home, Dylan found himself thinking about Grace's words. He, who had always believed in coldness and objectivity, began to question his own beliefs. The world he had always controlled so well seemed, little by little, to be affected by her presence. And as he looked out at the view from his luxurious apartment, a doubt tormented him. Was it possible that this agreement was more than just a transaction? Dylan and Grace continued to fulfill the agreement, but something in their dynamic had changed. To all appearances, they were a couple attending events and dinners, and Grace was increasingly present in Dylan's daily life. Over time, she began to explore the more human and less calculating side of the millionaire, sparking a curiosity in him that he couldn't ignore. One weekend, Dylan invited her to spend the day at one of his seaside properties. The invitation wasn't part of the agreement, but he argued that as husband and wife, they needed to build a convincing image even for those closest to them. Grace accepted, but a strange feeling ran through her chest. She knew she was getting more involved than she should. When they arrived at the beach house, Grace was enchanted by the scenery, a beautiful and private place with a stunning view of the ocean. It was the kind of setting she had never imagined experiencing up close, and she found herself lost in the surrounding beauty, letting out a genuine, light, and serene smile. Dylan watched her, capturing that moment with an intensity that surprised him. He was used to luxury and expensive properties, but for the first time, he realized it didn't mean as much without someone to share it with. Grace made that environment seem new, fresh, bringing a feeling that everything around gained more life. "Do you never get tired of a place like this?" she asked, still admiring the view. "It's so surreal." "To be honest, it's been a long time since I've stopped to enjoy this place," he replied, crossing his arms while looking at the sea. "Usually, I'm always thinking about the next step, the next deal." Grace looked at him with curiosity. "Sometimes I think you forget to live." Dylan let out a brief laugh, a rare sound from him. "Live? What does that mean to you, Grace?" She smiled, thoughtful. "To me, living is enjoying moments like this, valuing what we have now and the people around us. I've never had a lot of money, but I've always had my dreams and the people I love close by. That's enough." He watched her, fascinated by her simplicity and sincerity. Grace had a way of seeing the world that contrasted with everything he knew, and her perspective seemed to slowly envelop him in a world he had never explored. After a while in silence, Dylan invited her for a walk on the beach where they talked about their lives, their dreams, and even about the past. Grace shared stories of her childhood and the challenges of opening the cafe, while he found himself revealing small fragments of his life, things he had never thought important to share with anyone. During the walk, Dylan felt surprisingly comfortable next to her. The conversation flowed naturally, without pressures, without contracts or obligations. It was just him and Grace, two people seemingly so different, but with a connection that seemed to have strengthened without them realizing it. Later, as they returned home, the silence between them felt different, almost heavy with a tension neither seemed to know how to resolve. Grace sat on the couch and watched Dylan with an expression he couldn't decipher. There was a mix of curiosity, tenderness, and maybe a bit of insecurity. "You're not as cold as you seem, you know?" she said suddenly, breaking the silence. He smiled slightly, surprised by the comment. "And what does that mean?" "It means you hide behind this distant and calculated exterior, but there's more to you than that. I can see it." Grace hesitated, as if afraid she was crossing a line. "And even though this is a contract, I think I'm starting to like seeing the side of you that even you don't seem to know." Dylan was at a loss for words. Her depth hit him, and he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a vulnerability that left him unsettled. He moved closer, sitting next to her, in a space that felt too close for an agreement. "Grace, this between us is temporary, you know that," he said, more to himself than to her. It was as if he needed to remind himself of that truth to stay in control. But as he spoke, he realized the words didn't sound as true as they once did. Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I know, but sometimes the temporary can be significant too. The silence between them spoke more than any words could. And at that moment, Dylan realized that this temporary alliance was transforming everything he thought he knew about love, about connections, and most importantly, about himself. The following week, Dylan and Grace were invited to a charity gala organized by one of Dylan's biggest business partners. The event was a significant occasion, full of influential people, investors, and renowned figures, and their presence as a couple was almost mandatory. For Dylan, these events were common and routine, but for Grace, the mere thought of mingling with high society made her nervous. On the night of the gala, Grace wore an elegant dress that Dylan had chosen for her. The simplicity of the fabric complemented her natural beauty, and as she approached him, ready to leave, Dylan found he couldn't take his eyes off her. She was radiant, and her natural demeanor made her presence stand out in any setting, without even trying. "You look beautiful," he said in an almost inaudible tone, surprising himself. Grace smiled, shyly, as he offered her his arm. On the way to the event, she was visibly uneasy, trying to control her anxiety. Noticing this, Dylan tried to reassure her. "Remember, we're in this together. Just be yourself." Grace nodded, trying to calm down. She knew that being by Dylan's side helped her face the fear of being in such a sophisticated environment, and at the same time, his closeness made her feel something she was trying to avoid. But no matter how hard she tried to keep the situation as just an agreement, she found herself increasingly drawn to him, especially now that she knew him better. When they arrived at the luxurious venue, Dylan held her hand for a moment, a silent assurance that he was by her side. That simple gesture of support, though calculated to maintain appearances, made Grace's heart race. They entered the gala as a couple, and Grace tried to take in the atmosphere, responding to curious glances and greetings with a light smile. Throughout the night, Dylan introduced her to his partners and investors. Grace was surprised to find how much she enjoyed hearing about Dylan's world. One he had always kept professional and distant, but was now sharing with her, even if only to keep up the illusion of marriage. Gradually, she felt more confident and at ease, and even found herself enjoying the evening. At one point, while they were talking with one of Dylan's longtime investors, Grace noticed a change in his expression, a rigidity she had learned to interpret as tension. The man, Mr. Barnes, was a close friend of George's, and when he spoke about Dylan's grandfather, he gave the young businessman a direct look. "Old George always had a big dream for you, Dylan. He wanted you to find someone who truly valued you, someone who would make you rethink your priorities," Barnes said, with a shrewd glance towards Grace. "And I must say, seeing you finally married to someone so charming is a great relief." Dylan forced a smile, thanking him, but the weight of the words seemed to affect him. Grace noticed the tension in his posture, and in an instinct of protection, lightly squeezed his hand, offering silent support. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Barnes, who smiled with satisfaction and walked away to mingle with other guests. When they were alone, Dylan sighed, relieved but also uncomfortable. "It's strange how everyone seems to have an opinion about my life," he murmured. Grace smiled, trying to ease the tension. "They just want the best for you, Dylan. Your grandfather and Mr. Barnes, it seems they really care." Dylan looked at her, and for the first time, Grace saw vulnerability in his eyes. "My grandfather always thought I was incomplete because of how I viewed life and relationships. He used to say that success without someone to share it with is just emptiness." Grace stayed silent, absorbing the weight of his words. She never imagined that someone like Dylan, who seemed to have it all, could feel such a deep void. And suddenly she realized he might be struggling with something bigger than she had imagined. As the two moved to a quieter corner of the room, Grace, feeling the need to say something comforting, finally murmured, "Maybe he just wanted you to allow yourself to be happy, Dylan. Not for what you've achieved, but for what you live, what you feel." He looked at her, visibly moved. Her sincerity disarmed him, and no matter how hard he tried to maintain his coldness, Grace seemed to see beyond his facade. She saw the man behind the businessman, someone carrying expectations and loneliness, and it made him feel a connection he hadn't experienced with anyone else. "Maybe you're right," he said, almost in a whisper, not breaking eye contact. The tension between them was palpable, And at that moment, the contract binding them seemed to dissolve into something more complex. Something both were beginning to recognize but still feared to admit. In that room, full of influential people, Dylan and Grace, for the first time, were truly alone with each other. And in silence, both felt that their sham marriage was becoming more than just an agreement. And the question lingering in the air was simple but unsettling. How far would this take them? In the days following the gala, the atmosphere between Dylan and Grace transformed silently but overwhelmingly. It was as if their agreement had taken on a new depth, a significance both avoided admitting, but that became harder to ignore with each exchanged glance. Grace, increasingly involved, noticed Dylan's barriers faltering, as he seemed to struggle against the emotions emerging, challenging his usual control. Then, on a quiet afternoon, Dylan received an unexpected call. His grandfather, George's caretaker, informed him that he was hospitalized again. The urgency in the caretaker's voice shook Dylan, awakening a fear he tried to keep buried, the fear of losing the one who, despite everything, was his greatest reference. Determined to get to the hospital as quickly as possible, Dylan hesitated for a moment before asking Grace to accompany him. "I think my grandfather would be happy to see you. He's always been the biggest enthusiast of this marriage," he said in a low, hesitant tone, as if he didn't want to reveal how much those words truly meant. Grace nodded, sensing Dylan's tension. During the drive to the hospital, the silence between them was thick but filled with unspoken feelings. Dylan was absorbed in thought, and Grace noticed, observing him in profile, that his connection with his grandfather was stronger than he let on. When they arrived at the hospital, Dylan guided her through the corridors to George's room. The soft light from the windows filled the space, and the elderly man slowly opened his eyes upon hearing their steps. Seeing them together, George's face lit up, and he gave a weak but genuine smile. "Ah, my favorite couple," he said in a good-humored tone, even though his voice was weaker than before. Grace approached the bed and gently held George's hand. She felt his fragility, but also a quiet strength, as if he understood more than anyone there. Looking at the elderly man, she realized the affection he felt for Dylan went far beyond the desire to leave his fortune to him. It was a sincere wish for his grandson to know true love. Dylan, trying to stay composed, received a thoughtful look from his grandfather. "You seem tense, my boy. Is everything okay?" George asked, with a tenderness that broke down any defense Dylan might still have. Dylan hesitated, but replied with a tired sigh. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not being the grandson you expected, that I'm failing in some way." George's gaze softened even more, and he squeezed Dylan's hand with affection. "All I ever wanted, Dylan, was for you to find someone who could show you what really matters. This marriage, I pushed for it, because I thought it might give you that, something far beyond business or money." George's words struck deeply in Grace, filling her with an unexpected warmth. Until then, she had believed the contract was a cold formality, but now she realized that George saw something much bigger. He wanted Dylan to experience true love, to finally understand the value of sharing his life with someone. Dylan lowered his head for a moment, visibly touched. I never understood your insistence before. I always thought you were stuck in old-fashioned ideas, that it was all just sentimentality." He glanced briefly at Grace, who looked away, feeling exposed. "But now, I'm not so sure anymore." George laughed softly, a laugh full of understanding. "Sometimes, all we need is a chance to see things differently." "Grace," he said, looking at her with genuine affection, "you brought something I knew Dylan needed. Thank you for that." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, moved by George's kindness, but along with gratitude, a weight of guilt came over her. George believed the marriage was real. To him, there was no doubt that the relationship between her and Dylan was genuine. This left her uneasy, an anxiety beginning to grow in her chest. After a long conversation, Dylan and Grace said their goodbyes to George. The old man watched them leave, his gaze serene, as if he knew the feelings between them were real, despite all the resistance. Little did he know that the comforting illusion he held was about to be confronted. In the parking lot, as they walked in silence, Grace could no longer hold back her words. "Dylan, your grandfather believes in this marriage. He really thinks we're together for real." Dylan stopped and remained silent, feeling the weight of that revelation. I know, and it's bothering me. He believes I've found what he always wanted for me, and part of me wants to honor that, but another part knows we're living a lie. Grace felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of sadness and anguish. Dylan, he just wants you to be happy, and maybe, without realizing it, you're closer to that than you think. Dylan sighed, his gaze distant. This agreement, Grace, it changed something in me, and maybe it changed you too. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting confused, intense emotions. Grace held his gaze, but inside her, the conflict was enormous. She knew the truth needed to be revealed, but she feared the impact it would have on George. And at that moment, she felt that the next encounter with him could be decisive. After Dylan and Grace's visit to the hospital, George began to observe the couple more critically. Something in that interaction had made him suspicious. He knew his grandson. He knew Dylan had always been distant and business-focused. That sudden transformation seemed forced, artificial. George decided to investigate the marriage that intrigued him so much. Days later, with the results in hand, the confirmation of his suspicions hit like a blow. The marriage between Dylan and Grace was nothing more than an agreement, a carefully crafted sham so that Dylan could fulfill the will's clause and inherit the family fortune. To George, this was more than just a lie. It was a personal betrayal. He, who had raised Dylan with solid values, never imagined his grandson could do something so cold and calculated. Thus, George, hurt and disappointed, decided to confront him one last time. Dylan was called to the hospital again. He entered the room with a serious expression, but the usual slight smile disappeared upon seeing the icy look on his grandfather's face. George watched him with an air of disappointment that immediately made Dylan's heart tighten. Without preamble, the old man began. "Dylan," he said, his voice firmer than ever, "I had your marriage to Grace investigated." Dylan froze, a chill running down his spine. He tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of George's words made it clear that his grandfather knew everything. Even before he could muster a response, George continued, "How could you do this to me, Dylan?" The pain in his voice was palpable. "I always wanted you to find someone who made you happy, someone who showed you that life isn't just numbers and contracts. The only reason for that clause was to see my grandson become a more humane, happier person. But instead, you deceived me, made me believe this marriage was real." Dylan lowered his head, unable to meet his grandfather's gaze. He felt the weight of shame and knew that for the first time, there was no escaping this situation. He had betrayed the trust of the only family member who truly cared about him. "I only did it because I needed the inheritance to keep the company projects going, Grandpa," he murmured, his voice shaky. "I thought that was what mattered most to you." "Important?" George shook his head, disappointed. "What I wanted, Dylan, was to see you live, to see you love and be loved. You've always been a solitary, closed-off man. I just wanted you to see that there's more to life than business and numbers. But with this lie, you failed me." Dylan felt the impact of those words like a knife to his heart. He never imagined it meant so much to his grandfather, that the inheritance wasn't about money, but something much deeper. George took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. "Because of this, Dylan," he continued, "you won't receive the inheritance. I'd rather it go to causes that truly promote human value. Someone who did what you did doesn't deserve our family's legacy." Dylan remained silent, unable to protest. He knew that nothing he said would change George's decision, and deep down, he knew he deserved this consequence. That same night, leaving the hospital, Dylan went straight to Grace's apartment. He knocked on the door with a heavy heart he couldn't control. When she opened it, she immediately saw the tension on his face. "What happened, Dylan?" she asked, her voice worried. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Grace, our contract is over." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? My grandfather found out everything. He knows the marriage was a sham, that we did it to fulfill the clause and secure the inheritance. And now he's decided I won't get anything," he explained, each word hitting like a blow. Grace swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. Dylan looked at her with a bitter expression. But there was something else. Something that felt like a goodbye. "But I'll honor what I promised. You'll get the money for the cafe. "You don't have to worry," he said in a distant, almost mechanical tone. "Now that the deal is over, we don't need to pretend anymore." Grace felt a tightness in her chest, as if those words were cutting something she wanted to preserve. Even knowing it all started as a contract, she didn't expect it to end so coldly, as if nothing they lived through had truly meant anything. "So that's it?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "That's all?" Dylan looked away, trying to hide the pain in his eyes. "Yes, Grace, the contract is over. You can go on with your life, and I'll go on with mine." Grace stood still, trying to process everything. Finally, she just nodded, stepping back and closing the door without looking back. And so, the marriage that had been a lie ended the same way it began, with a cold and impersonal agreement. The following days for Dylan were lonely. He tried to return to his routine, diving into company projects, but nothing seemed the same as before. There was a constant absence, a void he couldn't fill, no matter how much he worked. He missed Grace. He missed the conversations, the quiet smiles, the silent glances they exchanged without anyone noticing. The emptiness in his life was overwhelming, and gradually, he realized it wasn't the inheritance he had lost. It was her. Grace. The memories of the moments they shared haunted him, making him question everything he believed in. He tried to convince himself that the feeling would pass, that it was just a phase, but the more days went by, the more he found himself captive to an inescapable truth. He had fallen in love with her. And now, he was alone. As he watched the city skyline from his office window, Dylan realized that all the money and power he had accumulated over the years held no value. The real loss he felt was Grace, and the empty life he now tried to fill seemed heavier than any legacy. Dylan Langford, the man who had always lived for work, now faced the harsh reality that without the love he had discovered with Grace, he would never be truly happy. Dylan tried to return to his routine, but the void Grace left made everything unbearably monotonous. Every meeting, every decision he made at the company, his mind drifted back to the moments he spent with her. The memories came unexpectedly. A smile, a conversation, her gentle touch when he needed it most. One day, exhausted from fighting his feelings, Dylan closed his laptop and left the office early. He drove aimlessly, trying to find a way to fill the void, but all he could do was remember his grandfather's words. George didn't want a wealthy and successful grandson. He wanted to see him happy, transformed by a true connection. And Dylan had failed in that, sacrificing the only person who truly made him feel alive. As he drove, the guilt and longing turned into a decision. He knew he needed to win Grace back, not because of the contract or any clause, but because he genuinely wanted her, because he loved her. At that moment, he turned around and headed to Grace's cafe. The sign was still lit at the entrance, but inside, the tables were empty and Grace was sitting alone at the counter, distractedly going through a ledger. When she saw him, her eyes widened, surprised and confused. "Dylan?" Her voice trembled slightly. "What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, trying to organize everything he wanted to say. "Grace, I know it might be too late, but I need to tell you, everything has changed for me." Grace looked away, clearly cautious. "Dylan, we both know this all started as a lie. You wanted the inheritance and I just wanted to save the cafe." "I know," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But in the middle of all this lying, I found something real. I found you. And even though I started this as a contract, I now know that what I feel for you is real." Grace looked at him in silence, her heart torn between hurt and hope. "And what makes you think we can just forget everything and start over?" Dylan felt the weight of her question. He knew winning her back wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't give up. "I'm not asking you to forget, Grace. I'm asking for a second chance. I was wrong. I lied, but I also learned. My grandfather was right. He wanted me to change, to understand the value of true connections, and you're the only person who showed me that." Grace kept her eyes fixed on him, still hesitant. "You hurt me, Dylan." I was starting to believe that. Maybe all of it was real. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Grace, I don't know if I can undo what I did, but I can change what we are now. I want to be by your side, to support your dreams, to be part of your life, not as a contract, but as a man who's completely in love with you." Grace felt tears forming, but she stayed calm. His words seemed sincere, and finally, she saw the man she always knew he could be. "Dylan," she murmured, emotional, "I just wanted something real." He smiled, his eyes shining with the promise of a new life. "And I want that too. If you give me a chance, Grace, I promise everything will be different. I just want to make you happy." Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the choice. But as she looked at him, she realized that the man in front of her was different from the one she had known. He was willing to let go of control, to show vulnerability, and to value the connection they had created. Finally, she nodded, letting hope blossom again. "Okay, Dylan, let's start over, but this time, no lies." Dylan smiled, pulling her into a tight hug, feeling like the emptiness in his heart was finally complete. And at that moment, they knew they were ready to build a new story, a real story, without contracts or clauses, but with the commitment to be happy together. Months had passed since Dylan and Grace decided to start a new life together. Since then, he felt the transformation in every detail of his daily life. Her presence brought new meaning to everything, a happiness he had never experienced before. And, as the days went by, the certainty grew in his heart. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. On a quiet night, while having dinner in Grace's cozy apartment, Dylan felt the perfect moment approaching. He held her hand, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made Grace hold her breath. "Grace," he began, his voice soft but full of emotion, "since you came into my life, everything has changed. I thought I had everything, but I found out I had nothing until I met you. You showed me what it is to truly live, and I can't imagine my life without you." Grace smiled, but her eyes were shining with tears. She knew every word he said was sincere, because she felt the same. "Dylan," he smiled, pulling a small box from his coat pocket. "Grace Evans, would you do me the honor of being my wife? Not for a contract, not for convenience, but for love, for everything we've built together?" Grace brought her hands to her mouth, surprised and emotional. The sight of the ring shining in the little box and the look of love in Dylan's eyes made her heart overflow with happiness. With tears streaming down her face, she nodded, barely able to contain her emotion. "Yes, Dylan, I accept with all my heart," she replied, letting herself be enveloped in his embrace as he spun her around, both laughing and crying at the same time. In the days that followed, Dylan knew there was someone very important who needed to hear the news: his grandfather, George. George's recovery was still slow, but he was at home, enjoying the comfort of being back. With Grace's ring in his pocket, Dylan drove to his grandfather's house, determined to share everything. When he arrived, he found George sitting on the porch, looking at the garden with a calm expression. The old man smiled as he saw his grandson approaching, but soon noticed the seriousness on Dylan's face and stayed silent, waiting for him to speak. "Grandpa," Dylan began, with a softer and more respectful tone than ever before, "I had to come here to tell you what happened, and also to ask for your forgiveness." George raised an eyebrow, but kept a gentle look. "Forgiveness, my boy? For what?" Dylan took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. "I know that, at the beginning, I failed you. That marriage with Grace was a lie, a cold agreement so I could get the inheritance. I was blinded by ambition, thinking that was what mattered. But you were right. I needed someone by my side, someone to show me what truly living means." George remained silent, but there was an emotional expression in his eyes. He continued to listen, giving Dylan the space to open up. "I fell in love with her, Grandpa. Truly. And now I can't imagine my life without Grace. You made me realize that what I sought in the inheritance had no value without someone to share life, dreams, and achievements with. And that person is her. I just wanted you to know that Grace and I are getting married, for real. And I really want to see you there." George took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with tears. He had dreamed of this moment, the day his grandson would understand that the true legacy of life isn't money, but the love and connections we create. "Dylan," George began, his voice filled with emotion, "nothing in the world could make me happier. Knowing that you found someone like Grace, someone who truly completes you, that's the greatest gift I could receive." Dylan stepped closer, feeling his emotions overflow, and held his grandfather's hands. "I'm so sorry for lying to you. I thought I was being smart, but I was actually lost. You always wanted the best for me, and now I understand what that means." George pulled him into a firm embrace, something rare between them, but at that moment it seemed the only way to express what they felt. "My boy, what matters is that you found your way. Grace is a wonderful woman, and I know you will be very happy together. I'd be honored to be there at the wedding, seeing you take this step, this time, with your heart." Dylan smiled relieved and felt the weight of his wrong choices finally lift. He had spent so much time building a life based on material values, but now, with Grace and his grandfather's support, he felt complete for the first time. As he said goodbye to George, Dylan's heart was filled with gratitude and love. He knew he was about to start a new chapter, a life with Grace built on truth and sincerity. As he left, he heard his grandfather whisper, almost like a secret between them, "Remember, my boy, the true legacy is the one you build with love. That's the only one that lasts." With those words etched in his mind and heart, Dylan left with a smile, eager to begin his life with Grace, knowing that this time, what united them was the purest and deepest truth. The big day finally arrived. Dylan woke up that morning with a feeling he had never experienced before, a mix of anxiety, joy, and deep peace. From today on, he and Grace would be united, not by a contract, but by a genuine commitment, a choice of love. Grace was in the preparation room, surrounded by friends and family who shared her happiness. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her veil with trembling hands, still in awe of what was about to happen. It was hard to believe that this union, which started as a facade, had evolved into something so deep and real. This wedding was everything she never imagined she would have, a celebration of love, a genuine beginning with the man she had learned to love. Outside, the guests were beginning to take their seats. George was there, sitting in the front row, with a serene and emotional look. He no longer had the same strength as before, but nothing would stop him from being present to witness his grandson's wedding. With every smile and greeting he received, he responded with an expression of pride and contentment, knowing that his vision for Dylan's future was unfolding even more beautifully than he had imagined. When the music started, Dylan took his place at the altar, his heart racing. He kept his eyes fixed on the entrance of the church, eagerly waiting for the moment he would see Grace. And then she appeared, radiant, walking slowly toward him, her eyes shining with emotion. Each step she took was like a reminder of everything they had been through, and every obstacle they had overcome to be together. When they met at the altar, Dylan held Grace's hand, smiling in a way that revealed the depth of his feelings. It was a mix of gratitude, love, and reverence for everything she meant to him. Grace returned the smile, feeling completely secure by his side. The officiant began the ceremony, but for Dylan and Grace, the world around them seemed to disappear. It was as if they were in their own universe, where every word and every glance carried the weight of everything they had learned together. When it was time for the vows, Dylan looked into Grace's eyes and began, his voice trembling with emotion. "Grace, when we met, I was a closed-off person, blinded by work and control. But you showed me a side of life I had never explored, a side full of love, laughter, and moments that I now know are the most important. You brought a meaning to my life that I never imagined. And today, I promise to love you with all that I am. I promise to be your partner, your support, and to make every day by your side a conscious and true choice. You are my life, my joy, and I am eternally grateful to have found you." Grace held back tears, moved. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath, letting the love she felt for him guide her words. "Dylan, you entered my life in an unexpected way, and from the beginning, you showed me a world I never imagined living in. I've learned from you the importance of being true, of seeking what really matters, and of never giving up on those we love. Today, I promise to love you without reservation, to be by your side in all moments, and to build with you a life full of love, companionship, and happiness. You are the love I've always dreamed of, and I know that together we will be stronger than we could ever be alone." The officiant declared them husband and wife, and as they sealed their commitment with a kiss, the hall filled with applause and emotion. George watched the scene with tears in his eyes, knowing that, at that moment, the true legacy of the Langford family had been passed on. Not the money, but the ability to love and build something real. At the reception, while everyone celebrated, Dylan and Grace danced together, lost in each other, feeling that they were finally where they had always belonged. The smiles, the looks, and the words exchanged between them were witnesses to a love that had grown between lies and a contract, but had transformed into a sincere and deep union. That day, surrounded by friends and family, Dylan and Grace began a new life, with the promise that their love, built through obstacles and twists, would now be the foundation of lasting happiness. George, watching closely, smiled contentedly, knowing that his mission was complete. He had shown his grandson what truly mattered, and seeing the happiness on Dylan and Grace's faces, he knew that this love was destined to last. And so, under the blessing of all those who loved them, Dylan and Grace began a new journey, a true and eternal marriage, with the promise that, from now on, they would always be one. What did you think of Dylan's attitude toward his grandfather? Share your opinion in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to stay updated on all our stories, and feel free to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the final screen.